weirdly.
Great.
Hi, everyone. Well, my name is Elaine Hamm, and I am the director of the Alliance for Artificial Intelligence in Healthcare, or the AAIH. A lot of vowels. But I wanted to do a little bit something different where we talk about one of the white papers that one of our members has created. And creating a little bit of a fireside chat, fireside in terms of the virtual world. Sorry, I should have put up behind me some type of fireplace roaring behind me, but unfortunately, I didn't think that far ahead. But I'm here with Luka Jelcic, and I said that wrong again. But he's from DeciBio, one of our member organizations. And DeciBio is a strategy consulting and marketing intelligence firm specifically focused on precision medicine. And within that, has a specialty within AI. Luca has recently co-authored a really interesting white paper, which we'll put in the show notes, really focusing on some of the major inflection points shaping AI and drug development. And today I thought we would take some time to dive a little bit deeper into the paper, talk a little bit about what's happening in the field, maybe go through some real world challenges. And if I can get Luca to think about a crystal ball, maybe look into the future a bit too. So, Luca, thank you so much for being here. And please tell me the correct way of saying your last name.
Thanks, Elaine. It's Jelcic, but I think you pronounced it pretty well.
Okay, good.
It's always an issue. So yeah.
Well, better than my last name, which is basically a food with an extra M. So, but anyway, let's start us off by talking a little bit about your paper. So your paper is really focused on AI and drug R&D, really entering a new maturity phase. It's been around for quite some time. We didn't always call it AI at the time, but it's been around in our industry of drug development for quite some time. So set the stage for us. What makes this moment different from some of the previous, waves of AI excitement we've seen?
Yeah, definitely. I think what how this kind of paper came about is that me and my co-author, Anastasia Christensen, were sort of discussing the field and how it has evolved. And to your point, this has been technology that's been within pharma R&D for quite some time, and that you know we've seen a lot of sort of ups and downs. And currently, where we're approaching is sort of this new maturity phase, and we thought it'd be a good point in time to actually sit down and reflect on what's been happening and where we're heading towards now. And with this sort of new maturity phase, I think that's a combination of multiple things. I think that what's happening is people are realizing there is value behind this. Obviously, there's been hypes and hype cycles around this for quite some time as well.
Definitely.
And there's some value that actually is being seen on the market. And I think consequently, there's more investment in generating more data that's AI specific, that's AI focused. There's more investment in technology, and we also see sort of some very interesting, quite alien players, to the field, big tech entering the space, with a completely different approach. And obviously, they're behind a lot of the infrastructure there. So, a lot of interesting forces that are mingling. There's all of this is happening on the backdrop of a very sort of down market for biotech in general. So we thought this is a good time to sort of pause and reflect and see sort of where we're heading next. And we think this is that sort of new maturity phase that we see sort of AI being focused more on specific point use cases rather than sort of the full R&D value chain, as has sort of been the efforts before.
Well, and as part of this paper, you actually went through and interviewed a number of different senior pharma executives. So, what stood out to you about how organizations are really thinking about AI adoption today?
Yeah, that was a really interesting part of the research because I've gotten to see sort of hear many different voices from many different organizations, and I think kind of a common theme that emerges is that as even senior leadership is realizing there's value behind this, there are clearly sort of biopharmas that have been investing in this for quite some time that are sort of leading the pack, and then there are the ones who are turning around to it now. And there's the gap is quite significant at this point. I've heard that it might take up to 5 years to sort of catch up with the leaders
Wow.
who are really kind of doubling down in this space. But beyond that, I think it's a lot of it's sort of to the leadership of all these specific companies. And I think what has really started to change, what we've noticed is that there's because people are realizing there's value behind this, there's more willingness to invest. So
Mm-hmm.
there's more willingness to sort of invest into partnerships, into getting this internally. But where there are still gaps is sort of investing to scale this up within the organization. So going from a pilot program to a solution that can be used across the organization, across the different teams, across the different departments. So there's sort of a lack of buy-in in certain organizations to do that, and that's the main difference. So everybody's sort of doing it, but some are doing it more so to say that they're doing it, and others are really doubling down there. And another thing that we kind of realize is, universal across the field is that there's something not enough talent for the potential that AI has. I've heard a good quote that one of the interviewees mentioned was, we have 100 people within AI trying to solve 1,000 problems, whereas if you look at other industries, for example, financial services, they have 1,000 people within their AI departments solving 100 problems. So
Hmm.
kind of gives you a reference point of how mismatched some of the sort of investment is.
Well, and you also point out in the paper some of, I mean, you talk about internal buy-in as being a challenge. And, as we have, some organizations realizing that they need to play catch up and they hear the sexy new word of AI and wanting to implement that in their company, you know, probably the classic barriers keep coming up of data quality and silos and challenges of integration. Why do you think those challenges are so persistent? Because those are something that we've seen in this industry for quite some time. So it's nothing really new for us. But if you're trying to get into the AI field, this can be probably a little jarring because you think that you could just get going on it, but it really takes a lot of investment.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And I think there's a couple of things there as well. I think one of them is, structurally, in terms of when we talk about data, right? There's patient data, there's more specific, sort of experiment data. I think, a lot of this has been collected now with AI in mind.
Yeah.
When we look at patient data, obviously that becomes also quite sensitive. So I think, depending on the data type that you talk about, there's different challenges associated with it. And I think that's kind of one thing that everybody has to deal with. But also, I think another aspect to that is everybody's viewing data as a competitive moat in a way. So there's this thinking that sort of AI algorithms, ML algorithms are becoming commoditized, but it's really the data that differentiates you. And so there's not necessarily a incentive for broader data sharing. So that's why you see a lot of data silos. And it's quite interesting, even within larger biopharma organizations, there are large data silos between the teams.
Yeah.
That's more so because there's not that infrastructure to share that as well. That's another aspect to this. And I think what could some ideas that kind of arose that potentially could resolve this is starting to think about data as a pre-competitive asset.
Hmm.
That's maybe more so wishful thinking, but I think that would be something that could help us push in the right direction, where some of these barriers, structural and sometimes artificial, could be at least lowered to allow sort of to lower the barriers of new entrants, because I think there's a lot of exciting innovations that can happen, but there's just simply this big challenge that, and I honestly don't think that we will ever kind of fully resolve this problem. I think it's
No,
always going to be there.
it keeps coming up, right? Like it's
Yeah.
nothing new to any industry that's dealt with large data sets have had some kind of challenge of silos and quality, and any kind of translational that needs to happen can be challenging. But now I think it feels like we have a little bit more of a microscope on it because we're now all wanting to get into how do we use data and how do we use AI. And it seems like it's just more amplified these days.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's also a lot of, new exciting technology that's helping us get, data that's really high powered for AI, for example, spatial and single cell analysis.
Hmm.
That's becoming really interesting. And I think a lot of, one way how people are going about resolving this is they're starting to generate their own data internally
Yeah.
for the algorithms. So and I think that's kind of the way that this will go. So which requires even more funding.
Yep.
You might see even a bigger difference between the sort of leaders and laggards. But we'll see.
At least more people are thinking about it when they're generating data of, well, can I use this for AI? And if I do want to, what do I need to do to make sure that it's good quality, is in a receivable format? And the only challenge then becomes, do people end up sitting on their what is now an asset, right? Data is now a commodity of, do they sit on it like a dragon on a hoard of coins, and making sure
Yeah.
no one else sees it. That's a whole other challenge, though, beyond just sort of structural issues that might be solvable.
Yeah. The incentives, yes, definitely.
Well, one of the pieces of your paper that I found interesting was your assessment of the target novelty piece. So when we think about drug development and the use of AI, it's, how can AI help us discover new targets? That's one of the first things that people talk about as it relates to AI and drug development. But you found that a lot of the AI first companies are working on fairly well-known targets. So what does that tell us about how the field is really approaching validation right now? And if is there going to be a shift in terms of what we use AI and how it relates to target or in drug
Yeah.
development specifically?
Yeah, definitely. I do think that the sort of there being a lot of older targets there is a reflection of effectively, trying to validate your approach,
Yeah,
your AI capability on how well it can design a drug on a known target. It's sort of a comparison, sort of, potentially designing something that's best in class or, faster than other approaches
right.
are. So I think that was kind of the initial angle. I think with that analysis, what we tried to do, or where that came from initially, was, it's really hard to assess how powerful or not these technologies are from these different players. And that was, one of the few data points that is out there that's sort of accessible that you can sort of somewhat try to systemize. And I'll be the first one to admit it's not necessarily a fully fair comparison because these are also publicly available
Sure.
data programs. So there might be, certain, marketing, strategies behind showing a program or not. But yeah, I do think that's largely a reflection behind, just showing that we can design a better drug using AI approaches on a known target. But I do think also, and what we picked up on is there's a bigger push towards, working on novel targets and, finding out new novel targets because ultimately, I think when people think about sort of AI and drug development is, treating diseases we previously couldn't treat, targeting new targets that we previously couldn't, haven't discovered, rather than, finding us incrementally better therapeutic for a known, ready treated target. So I do think, to be fair, it is a sort of an in-between step to, work on these, known targets, but I think there's, investors in particular are sort of more keen to see, okay, let's see the more new, the novel targets, the novel insights that we're getting through this technology.
Well, and sticking with that investor piece that you mentioned, and I've seen this myself as well. I mean, I have traditional drug development companies, and I've been going out and pitching them to investors for many years now. But there's a lot of companies that started out AI first, and they were software focused, and then they moved now into being fully, you know, big pharma company, or what rather full biotech mode companies where they're developing their own drug pipeline. How did that pivot play out? And what does that say about the market? Because I've seen that shift. We've talked to people that are in the AI, and by the way, we also now have our own drug, and that's an interesting piece that you guys noticed.
Yeah. I think sort of what started that was, initially as a software company selling through a SaaS model,
Yeah,
there's a natural ceiling you hit. Even if you embed yourself into every single pharma and biotech company, that still is a fairly limited,
sure.
space that you can penetrate. And, whilst revenues can be healthy through that, revenues from a potential blockbuster drug are much more enticing.
Yeah,
So,
a little bit.
so yeah, so a lot of these players started to sort of shift closer towards that, and I think that happened, through partnerships where it was, we offer the sort of software, the algorithmic approach, new targets that we develop through that, but then, we get piece of the pie, so to speak, if
Right.
a successful drug gets launched through that, and I think what then happened was, slowly moving even closer to that potential blockbuster drug and those types of earnings is that these companies started developing their own pipelines. And I think that was in part, that was the longer strategy to get to a point where effectively you're a biotech. And I
Yeah,
think for investors, it's also easier to understand that business model than we have AI, we do SaaS, but then we also do these
100%.
partnerships. So
Yeah, yeah.
I think I think there was a little bit of that going on there as well. And then ultimately, it is kind of going back to the target novelty assessment that we did. It's also a bit of a marketing piece to show, hey, we have a powerful capability. These are the drugs that we worked on, and these are the results.
Here's how we did
Uh,
it. Yeah,
exactly, and it's more tangible, the return on investment potentially that somebody who wants to partner with you can have. Um,
I can see
I
that.
don't think everybody managed to do this well. I think it's really hard to be a biotech company. It's really hard to uh, being an AI first company, and doing both is almost impossible. So I think a lot of what we've seen, a lot of these players who did that pivot and then IPO'd. So there's a good data point.
Yeah.
Have seen those sort of stock prices go down significantly, but it's a really hard pivot, and I do think that sometimes it potentially diluted the focus from really focusing on your capabilities to, now we have a pipeline that we have to manage.
And that's not an easy thing to just add on to your business model of now we're going
Exactly.
to have a drug development arm. But it makes sense that it's now it's this tangible business model that people have, they have an understanding of, and in a way it also is self-validating of your own platform. So I get the appeal, but that's a tall order. I can imagine. But
Yeah.
and I was in your paper, I was surprised to see this piece of it as well, as like, is there a shift from platform versus asset? I kind of seen it seesaw back and forth in my own pitching of like, well, we only want to see platform companies, and platform can mean a number of different things depending on who you talk to. And then some that now want just single asset, more, or rather asset led types of business models. What do you think? What's pushing that? What do you see being more in favored by investors these days?
I think now we're sort of back in that sort of asset-led business because I think the platform has been, something that's been pitched quite a bit. And I think, going back to the companies that have IPO'd and since seen their stock prices decline, that was all based on like we have this AI platform, we can develop a powerful drug portfolio through that, and
Yeah.
that somewhat failed to materialize. So I think now it's let's see the powerful drugs you can develop first, and then let's base our investment on that. So I think that's kind of the thinking that we're in right now, and I think a lot of sort of the newer generation companies that are focusing on being a sort of a point solution rather than having a full pipeline is also somewhat reflective of that, where,
Yeah.
I don't think there's as much enthusiasm to build a, drug pipeline as there was before, just because how hard it is.
Yeah.
There's definitely some winners though. No, no,
Sure.
don't want to sort of, but yeah, I do think it's sort of becoming quite hard, and that's why investors want to see something tangible first, an asset that actually has good outcomes, and then that kind of validates the platform and the approach that was taking and subsequently the investments that go into it.
That makes sense. Well, and to me, this is sort of when I first looked at AI for our very traditional drug companies that I'm a part of, clinical piece was one of those things that made, like, that was the easiest, lowest hanging fruit for me. I mean, I wasn't about to utilize AI to help us better understand our target or anything like that, or even come up with new drugs for, specific disease indications we were working on. I was more thinking about like, how do we stratify patients? How do we think about our clinical trials more efficiently? So that seems to be another shift that we see, where we're having more AI in the clinical development stages versus just the early discovery stages. Like, why do you think that shift is happening? Is it because there's just this natural progression of early stage has now progressed into clinical, or what's the shift, a result from, and what impact do you think that's going to have?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's exactly to the point that you mentioned, that kind of the clinical development has been gating, the progress that's been made in this sort of earlier discovery work. And I think that's one realization that people had. Another one is that, that's where pharma spends traditionally the most money, within a typical drug development cycle. That's where, the hundreds of millions of dollars uh, numbers come in. So, there's a big sort of optimization that can be realized there. On top of it is sort of a natural sort of gateway to the progress we've made so far. And I also think another piece there is traditionally there's been the most readily available data has been
Yeah.
data that's more suitable for target identification, for sort of drug lead optimization and drug discovery. So that's kind of where naturally the first sort of approaches have been built as well. So I think it's a combination of those things. And now that we're moving into the clinical development because of all of those, motivations and all of those sort of, potential gains that can get realized there, I think we'll also see sort of a bigger focus on patient data, which is also more harder to get and it's harder to get in subsequent
Complicated.
quantities. So that's why also this field has been sort of somewhat underdeveloped from an AI perspective as well, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to worry about patient consent when you're just looking at X-ray crystallography data and that type of thing. You don't have to worry about, IRBs and that type of thing. Well, shifting over to this sort of big tech's role in drug development, and we keep hearing a lot of companies saying AI lab loops or, AI in the lab, all these sort of different, iterations of how to bring AI into pharma, but not a lot of talk around how big tech is going to have to be involved in that. So, as companies start getting more deeply involved in this side, do you think that there's a risk that pharma is going to become too reliant on them for that initial sort of innovation infrastructure?
Yeah, I think that that's one of the most interesting pieces for me is sort of big tech's, incremental stepping into this field, and in the last couple of years or year or two, full on sort of entrance into the field through, for example, isomorphic labs, being launched from through Alphabet's sort of DeepMind arm. So, big tech is becoming fully embedded in this space, and I do think, the infrastructure that they provide is becoming absolutely crucial. And I don't know. Part of me thinks pharma is already quite dependent on that for full on
Yeah.
for fully leveraging AI and these capabilities in the space. So I think I'm quite curious to see what the future holds. It is they do offer crucial infrastructure,
Mhm.
and from some experts that we spoke to, some feel that ultimately they might be the ultimate winners in this space because of uh, the infrastructure that they own that they can then build on themselves as well, which we're also seeing to some extent. But I do think ultimately um, there's also a realization from big tech side that this is not necessarily a space that's sort of easy to disrupt. You can, step into this with sort of the typical tech thinking of like disrupt and optimize. This is a, very expensive. The R&D value chain is very expensive, honed over, decades of research. And there's a reason why, all these steps have to happen in that process. And I think there's more sort of leaning towards collaboration here, which I think is ultimately what's needed. This is a extremely difficult process to bring a drug to market, that I think needs both sides ultimately. But big tech is playing a sort of a pivotal role there, and they're definitely becoming the backbone of this new sort of AI revolution in a sense. I think they go by the old saying of when everybody's digging for gold, sell shovels. So that's kind of their position.
Definitely.
So yeah, I'm quite curious to see how the next couple of years develop because I feel like the field is accelerating quite a bit through this entrance, and big tech is also one of the few industries that has a lot of funding behind it, a lot of funding that they can deploy right now. So something that vastly kind of outscales pharma in a sense. So that will also help to this acceleration. So I'm quite curious, quite excited to see what the future holds.
Well, and we talked a little bit about these steps, and a lot of these, I mean, we talk about data silos, but there's also sort of, as we think about development, it's modular by nature in a lot of ways, and there's a lot of individual steps, but and AI has helped in those individual steps, whether it's discovery or optimization or clinical trial validation, et cetera. What you in this paper, I think you paint an interesting picture of like how AI could change the entire process versus just these iterative little steps that are part of the bigger pieces. How close are we to actually getting there though?
Yeah, that's also a really interesting point because I think initially, in the last couple of sort of decade or so, I think we got ahead of ourselves, and there's a lot of companies that are pitching we can change the whole process, and now we're moving back to actually we should focus on these point solutions and make sure that we're really, really
Yeah.
doing a great job. And then to now we're shifting back. Okay, now we actually have the capabilities to potentially start thinking about, reimagining in the near future the R&D process in a way. I do think there's sort of new developments that can help us get there. I don't think we'll get there anytime soon. I do think it's still now, if you look at the field, how's it shaping out? I do think, there's a lot of sort of emphasis on foundational models, which are also more tending towards sort of that, lead optimization or specific function across the value chain. But I do think with, new advents like quantum computing, which everybody's really excited about, that can help, really crunch the sort of multimodal data sets and data much faster. And then on top of that, with new inference engines, I think we can get to a point where, now AI is sort of enhancing what humans would traditionally do and speeding things up and potentially getting new insights faster to a point where, with this sort of powerful new capability of quantum computing and inference engines, we'll get to a point where these new technologies could help us understand and develop insights that humans could not even possibly do ourselves. So it's not only making us faster, but also sort of increasing the white space of things that we can kind of potentially explore, potential new assets, potential new targets, pathways that can get exploited for therapeutic purposes. So I feel that that's where we're sort of heading, and that's sort of the more optimistic vision of that. And I do feel like we are on the right path there, but I do think that's still sort of a little bit ways out before that starts materializing, especially that quantum computing piece. That's a sort of really early technology that, there's a lot of hype around it. I think there's a lot of potential, but from what I've seen, it's sort of going to be a decade or so before, that becomes converging with classical computing and really starts sort of exponentially getting better and giving us sort of that computational power that we need.
Stay tuned on that front then, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, before we wrap up, and I'm going to take notes on this question. If you could design the perfect AI first biopharma company today, what would it look like? And I'm not saying I'm going to start this, but I am going to take notes just in case.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good one. I've been thinking about that a lot. I think, to what we've been talking about, I do think there's a big focus on sort of the clinical use cases, and I do think that's where a lot of the sort of faster, quicker, earlier gains can get realized.
Sure.
So that's a space that, and I do think that's something that directly impacts patients as well.
Yeah.
It's just more direct with the patient population, the seeing whether the therapeutic works or not, and I do feel that's a really exciting area for me personally.
Yeah.
I do think that will also, because that means a lot of patient data will get needed. It's something more where I'm thinking about, how to get that data. I think bringing the patients along, making more patient centric, making patients, effectively sort of whole part of the company in a way.
Part of the journey. Yeah.
Part of the journey. I think that will be something which would be exciting rather than just like data mining, which is sort of somewhat anonymous, somewhat uh,
Yeah. Feels
sort of
cold. Feels too
feels
cold.
cold.
Like, yeah.
Exactly. So I think some of the sort of biggest gains will be realized there. And I think within today's context, it's probably really focusing on, beyond that, really focusing on a point solution, really focusing. I think there's a lot of exciting developments that are happening within, as I mentioned, sort of spatial single cell that can help produce a lot of powerful data for the earlier discovery work.
Yeah.
I know there's a lot of work being done for sort of, foundation model of the human cell and how the perturbations work there. So, although that's being done, I feel that's another field that I would, really go into and just really focus on that specific.
You keep
Uh,
mentioning that. I feel like that's where you secretly geek out is on the single cell stuff. So
yeah, it's definitely I think has a lot of potential. So
well, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing your insight and giving us a little bit more detail around AI and drug development. And we encourage everyone to check out the white paper that Luka was a co-author on, and you can find that on DeciBio's website. And we will also put a link in this post. And if you're interested in more conversations like us, follow us on AIH on LinkedIn, as well as DeciBio, and check out our website to find out if we're going to have future conversations like that. Anything else, Luka, before we wrap it up?
No, thank you so much for having me. This has been super fun to talk about the white paper. It's when we started working on that, we thought it was going to be, are we going to be done with this in a couple of weeks, but it
Yeah,
actually turned to be
never.
quite a bit
No.
longer.
It just
It
reminds you of
was
like how did I write those college term papers? Because it just seems like, oh yeah,
yeah,
I'll just knock this out and sit down and write it, and then no.
exactly. No, it turned into a journey, but I'm glad it did because I learned so much, got to talk to so many experts, and yeah, really glad to be able to share that here. And yeah, thank you so
Well,
much
it's a
for having me.
fantastic paper, and it really gives a sense of where we've been and where we're going in terms of AI and drug development. And you guys are any more future white papers coming up? Not to not to put some pressure on you after you just finished publishing this one, but if you have any others, please let us know because I think that this
Yeah,
is an important piece the AI in healthcare story. So
definitely will do. There's a couple of that I'm thinking about, but I think for now there's a bit of a break.
yeah,
But
yeah,
then yeah, definitely have a couple on the horizon. So yeah,
perfect. All right. Well, thanks so much, Luka, and thanks for joining us.
all right.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Elaine. Thanks.